November 1942. Buna, Papua New Guinea. The jungle was hell. American soldiers from the 32nd Division lay exhausted in their positions, staring at Japanese bunkers that seemed indestructible. For weeks they had attacked. For weeks they had failed. Men were dying from malaria, starvation, and enemy fire. General MacArthur, safe in Brisbane, blamed everyone except himself. Then General Thomas Blamey said something that changed everything. This is the story of an Australian general who refused to follow MacArthur's orders and defended his troops when an American commander wanted them thrown into the meat grinder. MacArthur's plan seemed simple on maps spread across conference tables in Brisbane. Australian forces would attack Gona and Sanananda. American forces would take Buna, clean, organized, efficient. Reality was different. The Australians had borne the brunt of land fighting in Papua New Guinea to date, with the only American troops to see action up to this time being some engineers who fought briefly at Milne Bay. The Australian 7th Division had fought across the brutal Kokoda track. They had stopped a Japanese advance that threatened Port Moresby. They had turned the enemy back through mountains so steep that supplies had to be carried by hand. Now, they were attacking fortified Japanese positions on the coast. The Americans were untested. The 32nd Division, U.S. Army, under Major General Edwin F. Harding, would attack Buna on the eastern flank. The Americans were green, having no combat experience and little or no jungle training. Blamey saw the problem immediately. He suggested something sensible. Deploy an additional Australian brigade to support the American attack on Buna. The Australians had experience. They knew jungle warfare. They could help the Americans succeed. MacArthur refused. He wanted American troops to prove themselves. This was their chance for glory. The American assault on Buna turned into a bloodbath. Japanese bunkers, constructed from coconut logs and earth, absorbed everything the attackers threw at them. Rifle fire bounced off. Grenades exploded harmlessly outside. Mortars made small dents, but achieved nothing decisive. American soldiers crawled through mud and kunai grass, trying to reach enemy positions. Machine guns cut them down. Snipers picked them off one by one. The casualties mounted. Progress measured in yards cost dozens of lives. Disease made everything worse. Major Martin O'Hare, Australian 1st Mountain Battery, claimed that some of the Green Americans were feigning sickness or accidentally shot in the hands and feet while cleaning their rifles. Whether true or exaggerated, morale was collapsing. The Americans had been promised air support would win the battle. It had not. They had been told Japanese defenses would crumble quickly. They had not. Men were dying in an operation that seemed impossible. MacArthur's response? Blame the troops. He told Washington that American soldiers were not fighting hard enough. He fired General Harding. He brought in Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger with dramatic instructions. Take Buna or die trying. Meanwhile, Australian forces faced even tougher opposition at Gona and Sanananda. Despite suffering heavy casualties, they kept fighting. They adapted tactics. They found ways to destroy bunkers one at a time. Progress was slow but steady. A high-level meeting was called at Port Moresby. The American offensive at Buna had stalled. MacArthur wanted more troops thrown into the attack. He suggested sending additional American units. Blamey was present. He had been overseeing operations from Port Moresby, watching both Australian and American forces struggle against fanatical Japanese resistance. He understood what was happening at Buna better than MacArthur did from his headquarters in Brisbane. When MacArthur proposed sending more Americans, Blamey spoke up. Blamey, at Port Moresby overseeing operations, objected, stating he would rather put in more Australians as he knew they would fight. The room went silent. Blamey had just told MacArthur that Australian soldiers were more reliable than American soldiers. He had publicly questioned the fighting ability of American troops. This was not diplomacy. This was blunt truth delivered without sugarcoating. According to Lieutenant General George Kenney, the commander of Allied Air Forces, Blamey frankly said he would rather send in more Australians as he knew they would fight. It was a bitter pill for MacArthur to swallow. MacArthur could not argue. His American division had failed at Buna. Blamey's Australian divisions had succeeded at Milne Bay, fought brilliantly on the Kokoda track, and were making progress at Gona despite horrific conditions. The record spoke for itself. This moment revealed something fundamental about Blamey's relationship with MacArthur. Unlike many Allied commanders who deferred to the American general, Blamey fought for his troops. He protected Australian interests even when politically inconvenient. Blamey was able to say to MacArthur that he would prefer Australian troops over American because he knew that at least the Australians would fight. Given the recent events, MacArthur couldn't really argue. The Australians captured Gona in early December. It fell after brutal close-quarters fighting. Australian soldiers had crawled through swamps, endured constant artillery fire, and fought their way through one of the strongest Japanese defensive positions in the Pacific. At Buna, the American attack finally succeeded only after Australian troops arrived to help. Experienced Australian units showed the Americans how to approach Japanese bunkers. Australian artillery supported American infantry assaults. Together, they finally broke through. Buna fell in early January 1943, but the cost had been enormous. The death rate at Buna and Gona, on Papua's north coast, was vastly greater than it needed to be. The Australians lost 3,471 casualties in the long campaign, of whom 1,208 were killed. MacArthur claimed victory in press releases. He mentioned American heroism extensively. Australian contributions were barely acknowledged. This pattern would continue throughout the war. Top Aussie commanders like General Thomas Blamey, who had to deal with the general's abrasive command style personally, felt they were treated as second-class allies and ignored in decision-making. They also seethed that MacArthur's self-aggrandizing press releases often left out that Aussie troops were on the front lines. But Blamey had made his point. In that meeting at Port Moresby, when MacArthur wanted more American troops sent into a failing operation, Blamey had defied him. He had defended his own troops and spoken uncomfortable truth about American performance. MacArthur ensured that American troops would never serve under Australian command again. He did this by reorganizing the Pacific Task Force and using American troops to push to the Philippines and the island-hopping campaign. This reorganization effectively sidelined Blamey. Australian forces continued fighting throughout the Pacific, but they operated separately from American operations. MacArthur controlled American forces directly. Blamey commanded Australians with decreasing influence over overall strategy. The relationship between the two generals remained professional but strained. Blamey had stood up to MacArthur when it mattered. He had refused to send more Australian troops into operations he considered wasteful. He had publicly questioned American military performance. These actions came with political costs. MacArthur had Prime Minister Curtin's complete confidence. Blamey did not. When MacArthur wanted something, Curtin usually gave it to him. When Blamey objected, he was often overruled. But at that moment in Port Moresby, Blamey had chosen his soldiers over his career. He had told MacArthur the truth, even though it was diplomatically disastrous. He had defended Australian troops and questioned whether throwing more inexperienced American soldiers into the Buna meat grinder would achieve anything except more casualties. History proved him right. When experienced Australian units finally supported the American attack, Buna fell quickly. The problem had never been lack of courage. The problem had been lack of experience, inadequate tactics, and unrealistic expectations from commanders who did not understand jungle warfare. Thomas Blamey remains controversial in Australian military history. He made mistakes. He unfairly relieved competent commanders during Kokoda. He protected his own position sometimes at others' expense. But at Buna, he did something remarkable. He defied the most powerful Allied commander in the Pacific. He defended his troops. He spoke truth to power, and he was proven correct. When MacArthur wanted to throw more American soldiers into a failing operation, Blamey said no. When MacArthur suggested more untested troops, Blamey offered experienced Australians instead. When MacArthur blamed everyone except himself, Blamey pointed out that Australian forces had succeeded where American forces had failed. That moment of defiance defines Blamey's finest hour. Not his strategic planning, not his organizational skills, but his willingness to stand up to Douglas MacArthur and say, "My soldiers fight, send them instead." MacArthur never forgot. Blamey paid a political price. But the Australian soldiers who would have been wasted in ill-conceived operations were saved. Sometimes refusing to follow orders is the right thing to do.